Hello and welcome back to the Medical Freedom Show. This is your host, Heatherlyn Martin, and today I am joined by Dr. Alexander, who is a Libertarian candidate for Congress in the 19th District of New York. That's our area. So welcome, Dr. Alexander.
Thank you, Heather. Call me Victoria, please.
I will. Thank you, Victoria. So a pleasure to have you on our show. Can you please tell us a little bit about your background, how you came to be running for Congress, and a little bit about what your views are?
My motto for running is decentralize the power. And that comes from my work as basically a complex systems science researcher. I'm a biosimulation specifically, but just to make it simple, I study complex systems like ecosystems, biological systems, intelligence, groups of people, social behavior. Mm-hmm. And what I've been interested in seeing is how rapidly a new solution or an adaptation can be discovered. And so it's basically the principles underlying the emergence of intelligent activity. And you probably know this from being familiar with this kind of thing, is true intelligence is distributed. The decision making is distributed throughout the body, throughout the ecosystem. There isn't an executive making all the decisions, sending messages down to the individual parts. It's a group effort. And so naturally that leads me to look at political systems and social systems and see the top-down decision-making and the bureaucracy, which to me is a definition of stupidity. Mm. When you codify and formulate the procedures ahead of time, you're making it possible for basically a machine to perform those functions without thinking. So you're removing intelligence from the entire operation. So granted, we do need some background procedures, some habits that we rely on, some conventions, some traditions that we draw from. But we always need to be adapting those in real time to the specific contexts that are going on. Mm-hmm. So all that, long story short, so as a philosopher of science, that's the background that I come from, and why the Libertarian Party resonates with me, because they are against the kind of top-down control of government, of the people. And to me, the free market is really a decentralized market where there is no top-down control like Federal Reserve control of the financial institution, and a regulatory body that can become corrupt. I'm sure we'll talk a lot more about that kind of thing in this hour.
Okay. Your field of study is very fascinating. Looking at all of the systems, that's something I am also fascinated with. Is just, I'm always trying to look at something and then back up to get more of the full picture. What else is influencing this activity? Even like some of the things we were just talking about before the show and just explaining medical freedom is, there's the micro concepts and the macro concepts around it. There's the individual choice aspect of it, and also the systematic aspects that we have to take into consideration. What you were talking about before about the systems of intelligence makes me think a lot about the new technology that is being born right now, which is AI. So
yes, I'm working on a critique of artificial intelligence from the perspective of my field, which is biosemiotics. We study how biological systems process information, to put it crudely. And biological systems have a much more sophisticated and very hard to codify process. Just to state it briefly, artificial intelligence is not intelligent. It is stereotyping on steroids. It is nothing but a glorified actuary table. And if it is used to make decisions in the court and in procedures, we will have, it will be an absolute disaster. If you think things are biased now,
right,
courts proceed, then you'll take the entire cultural biases that are inherent in any information that is fed into AI, and it will be compounded in every iteration.
It makes me think of the work of Alan Turing. You're very familiar with.
I am working on Turing's late work in Morphogenesis, where he discovered that
he's a very fascinating man and scientist.
Yes.
When I think a lot about his work and theories and views and just how we're developing with our technology now, and how he saw the
mandatory procedure that he underwent.
Oh, I know. Talk about medical freedom right there. It's just, yes. So if anyone is curious about that, the history of Alan Turing, he's a fascinating scientist, a genius, a brilliant man. One of the things he said is that the pairing of the human intelligence with the artificial intelligence could be just like the highest point of our intellectual and technological development. I feel that way sometimes, even working with Siri or Google. It's just whenever I have a question come to mind, I can draw upon the information instantaneously.
If that information is not biased by an AI program. So that's one of the problems. But
right.
The tool of the computer is absolutely phenomenal.
It is.
The human brain is phenomenal. Together, we are it's a great combination, and one should never replace the other. One is not better than the other. They're very, very different. And just to go back and clarify what we mean by Alan Turing's medical freedom, he was he was given the option of go to jail or take estrogen, female hormones.
Yeah, chemical castration because he was gay.
He's gay, yeah. So, yeah.
And that drove him to suicide. And what's really scary is there's talk about chemical castration coming back. I believe there's some states that are toying with that idea right now. And they're saying, well, it's for child molesters, which we know are a very unpopular population, a group of people. But the thing is, that's such a dangerous slope to go down. That's cruel and unusual punishment, and something that we as a country, I think, should be very leery of and do everything we can to avoid.
Yeah, let's talk about, I know a lot of your guests on this show talk about very knowledgeably from, different issues like vaccine safety and so forth. And that is not my area, but what I can talk about is the legislation and the philosophy behind the legislation. And so just to say what my role would be. Now I'm running for Congress in the 19th district against Antonio Delgado, who goes along with whatever legislation is presented. And this constant creation of more and more legislation, like something like 650 laws go on the floor every year. And legislators seem to think that their role is to create more laws that limit freedom in an effort to help the people. My role as a legislator would be to repeal a lot of the bad laws that have been passed. And your listeners are probably aware of the National Child Vaccine Injury Act, which removed liability from vaccine manufacturers for harm. And so now the taxpayers have to pay out those lawsuits, and there are billions of dollars worth of lawsuits, and we should never exempt a corporation from harm. The libertarian principle is that you must suffer the consequences of your actions. So if you're a business and you're making a faulty product, you have to be checked by that. If you harm someone,
I'm glad you brought that up again, and that's something that I think bears emphasis, is that vaccine producers are protected from liability. That takes away their incentive to create a vaccine that does not do harm.
Yes, and
so
so
all those checks and balances.
Yeah, so why do safety testing? You know, why do a blind study? Why do, you know, if you aren't going to be responsible? And another thing with corporations too is quite often, you know, some of the CEOs make bad decisions and they go ahead and release a product even though they're getting some feedback from the field saying this product is not safe. And they look at it, they weigh their odds. Well, you know, only 2 or 3, 4 or 5, 6, 100 people will die. We'll just get you know, we'll get a bigger insurance policy or something like that, or we'll just figure it into our profits. You know, our profits are this many billions, the payout maybe this. And so it's, for them, it's just a financial decision. And then maybe those people who made the decisions sell their stocks, get out of the company, move on, go somewhere else. And by the time the lawsuits are finally going around, as they are with Monsanto, for example, it's some stockholders, you know, retirees and school teachers who have that stock in their mutual fund. They may not even realize they have that stock. And they're the ones who end up paying for those decisions made by the CEOs. So that, you know, there's people who make the decisions that cause harm need to be criminally liable. And that is another libertarian principle.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Also, like now it's come to light, for example, with cannabis, how many medical conditions it treats or helps. And yet there's no accountability for all the people who've had to go without the medicine for all of these decades. There's no payout for them, or, hey, here, you can get your stuff for free for the rest of your life because we messed up. You know, there's just really no accountability, that the people are not being taken care of after they are harmed by these laws and regulations that put them into harm's way.
The first role of good government is to do no harm.
And you know, that used to be an oath that medical professionals had to take, and now it's not required.
So we were speaking a moment ago before we started recording, and you were telling me, updating me on an issue that you have some personal expertise with, and I am not familiar with some of those issues. And I said, and what I believe is that legislators are not going to be familiar with the science of most of the issues that come before them. And so we have to be very, very careful.
However, we do have a lot of legislators that seem to think that they're practicing medicine, who are writing laws about how doctors can operate and taking the controls away from the medical professionals and further away from the patient. I'm not saying you personally, but
it's absurd. It's absurd. And I feel like I'm fairly well informed about these issues, but I would never think that I am well informed enough to pass a law about something.
I wish more people would be that honest and
I understand
recognize the limits of where government ends and medical science begins.
Yes, science is ongoing.
Mm-hmm.
The community activity, it never ends. And so it's impossible to codify science into law. And a lot of times you may think that the
And yet they're
science
trying to do it all the time.
is settled at any time, but there may be new research going on. I know there's research going on with the use of LSD to treat post-traumatic stress disorder. Never would have thought it, 10 years ago. So we create laws. And so whenever you do that, you prevent science and experiments from continuing to research that area and find out new information. And I want to mention to you, I noticed that you interviewed some people in a group that I have been introduced to recently. You talked to the Buckbees and to Stu Summer, and I've been going out with that group every weekend, knocking on doors, telling them that I support medical choice and medical freedom. And the reason why I was introduced to this group is because I support what I call voluntary health for all, as opposed to mandatory med for all.
Right.
And I do believe that government has within its power to provide the community infrastructure, like the physical buildings, roads, transportation, hospitals, equipment, fiber broadband. The government can actually provide those things, but should never run them. Should not be involved in actually managing and making any decisions. And the decisions in a hospital should be made by the administration, by the medical professionals, together with their patients.
Absolutely. But they're not right now, and that is the problem, and people are dying for it.
Now, if we did that, if we relocated the decision making and the regulating to an ongoing dynamic body at the local level, within the local hospital, then we wouldn't need these regulatory agencies that get captured anyway by corporations.
No.
You can have the local communities making those decisions for themselves and being able, when they find out that they made the wrong decision about something, they could change it. But, and this is very important, no local body can make a decision and institute a new local law or rule or mandatory order that contradicts the US Constitution. Ever. That is not legal in this country. And our Governor Cuomo, has issued executive orders making everyone wear masks and stay home, which if you want to do that, if you're at risk, then you should. But it is not legal to ask everyone to wear a mask. And so that,
my biggest issue actually with the mask requirement, it's not so much the mask requirement, because when the weather is cold, we can see that we exhale a cloud with every breath. So the idea of the mask is, you're containing your cloud. And if everyone's kind of containing their cloud, it reduces the chance of an airborne virus such as a cold and flu being transmitted. So there is a value in that. Whereas I think we should be really concerned about are the issues of accessibility. For example, if the grocery stores are going to require the masks and some people who have a breathing difficulty can't go into the store, if the store is also saying you can't call in an order, we're not going to set up any mechanism for you to be able to get your supplies. And because this is what they were doing during the pandemic. I was trying to help some people who were in compromised situations to get certain necessities. And the stores, even though before the pandemic, you could order things and have them shipped or have them held for you, they just blanket wouldn't do that. So they're forcing people into the stores more. Like, I think we need to look at issues of accessibility
I have been saying this. One of the first things that I was saying, I actually spent the lockdown in Russia. I was there with on a Fulbright grant as part of the U.S. State Department. So I was there. I was in Russia for the lockdown, and they had similar procedures. What I would do if there were, again, some very, very serious epidemic in this country, I would work with volunteer organizations to have food and supplies delivered to people who had decided to stay home because they're at risk for some reason. And I would spend all my energies, and you could motivate volunteers to get that together. In Russia, it was teenagers who were volunteering to bring food.
No, I wouldn't say that the issue was really the manpower or the volunteers. But
stores.
What?
The stores.
Well, yeah, they seem to be all in a conspiracy to try to get people as exposed as possible, changing pre-existing procedures that would allow customers to place orders and just pick up when their orders are there, not to spend any other time in the store except getting their essentials and leaving. But instead they did away with all of that just to force people into the stores. The way the community has handled the pandemic just did not make any sense unless the end game is depopulation and population reduction. Try to expose
it almost seems like, I mean, what annoyed me a lot was the fact that the government decided who was an essential worker, and quite often those were people in low income jobs who had health problems, and they were put on the front lines, exposed to hundreds of people every day. And so this is what I'm talking about.
Also, it endangered them. Like, I actually did a video that is up on my YouTube where I just kind of did a rant about Walmart because I was trying to get specific toilet paper for certain people who have a medical need for it, a certain brand. So it was very specific what I had to go after. But I was actually being told in the store, just come in here and wait 4 to 6 hours here in the aisle, and if it gets unloaded in the truck, you can grab it. There was, the store employees could be taking the orders. People could just call in and say what they want. The store employees could have less contact with the people, which is...
It was a disaster. Things were...
absolutely a disaster. And people... like you say, the minimum wage workers, the people on the front lines, they're having to be flooded with people and contact.
Let me address though the issue of mandatory masks or mandatory anything by the government. So people may or may not think that they are useful, depending on what sort of research and who you've talked to, or depending on how deadly you think that the virus is for you in your particular category, your health category. Now, for people who are in the high risk category, I would have, if I had been in office, I would have advocated for some sort of disability payment for anybody in the high risk category to allow them to stay home. Now, what happened was a lot of people who are somewhat wealthy, who work for the government or who have some sort of office job, were able to stay home and work and get their full salary. I was working for the government. I was able to stay home and collect my full salary, while other people were working in the grocery store. I could see immediately the economic, the class problem in here and how the problem was addressed. People in lower economic groups were exposed.
Right.
And people who had jobs and could, so, right off the bat, this
absolutely
blatant abuse of lower income people.
But I want to remind our listeners that you are listening to the Medical Freedom Show with Heatherlyn Martin. Today I am talking to Dr. Victoria Alexander. She's a Libertarian candidate for Congress in the 19th District of New York. And thank you again, Victoria, for being on our show today and just bringing up all of these very important issues.
Thank you so
Going
much.
back to the grocery stores and the handling of the pandemic, one of the things I talked about in my little rant video was how back when we would get severe snowstorms in this area, it would sometimes, we would be without power for a week or more. There haven't been too many storms like that in recent years, but we used to get them like that. And the stores would continue to operate even though they didn't have the power. But they would just block off the store. You could only go as far as the cash register. Usually if you were going out to get groceries during one of these power outages, you'd make a list beforehand, give it to the people in the store, let the employees go and gather up, come back from getting your gas or whatever, pick up your groceries and leave. So there'd be very little contact in the store. This is the kind of protocol that they should have been setting up if there was a serious pandemic, so that the store employees would not be getting contact from the public, and the public would be actually getting the supplies that they would need, which would also put some intelligence, some human beings into the lines to prevent things like hoarding, like one person taking all the toilet paper for the community.
Do you think that during those power outages, the store owners and managers and employees came up with their own plan on the spot to just figure it out and see what worked best?
Probably, but everyone did pretty much the same thing. It was very standard.
Word got around. So why didn't that happen this time?
That's what I want to know. So we've had protocols for dealing with emergencies for about, what, 2-3 centuries of the same type of.
Yeah, you know, those protocols are just common sense. And
they're common sense.
Yeah, I don't.
What happened during the pandemic is online shopping completely shut down. You couldn't reserve anything. You couldn't order anything. You couldn't get toilet paper on Amazon during the early part of the pandemic.
I don't know what happened to you here in America with the toilet paper thing, but we always had it in Russia. The whole
you were over in Russia. How about that?
Fun of us. I don't know what happened. I mean, I guess the Russians have been through, you know, privation before. They're like, you know.
It definitely feels here in the United States like we're being run by some kind of algorithm that's completely out of touch.
I don't know
the human condition.
I don't know what the failure could have been in these independent stores. Maybe all of Walmart came up with the same procedure. I don't know, but my local grocery store, they have online ordering, and I don't know whether it stopped during that time or not.
Yeah, I was surprised even local mom and pop stores were just, well, we're not going to do any orders, we're just going to put it out there, and as soon as it goes, that's it. So it requires that the people come into the store. You know, you can't just say, I only want to come there when my product is there, just go in and get it and leave.
I don't know how that happened, and I would think that if there was a public demand for it, which absolutely there was a public demand for it, that they could have met that demand, and I don't know why.
The words that come to my mind are contrived scarcity.
Maybe.
That's what I definitely.
Yeah, I don't know. There were no shortages when I was experiencing lockdown. Let me talk about some previous legal cases with mandatory public health issues. And so it's leading to the larger question that we've already touched on is, you know, mandating public health. Who makes these decisions? You probably know about the Jacobson versus Massachusetts decision in 1905, I think it was, which mandated that everyone get a smallpox vaccination. I think it was smallpox. And a man named Jacobson decided he didn't want the vaccination because when he was a child in Sweden, he had gotten the vaccination and he had a very bad reaction to it. He was overly sensitive or had some sort of reaction. And so he refused to get the vaccination. He probably was immune. Anyway, it's kind of redundant, right? He'd already had it. I don't know why, but so he was fined. And he took his case to the Supreme Court. I know that he was only fined, he was not forced to take the vaccination. And that's the kind of thing that we're looking at now. Maybe the military won't beat down your door and inject you, but you might not be able to fly because you won't have a COVID passport, or you might not be able to use your credit card, or go to school, or go to a public event, or enter a store. So, you know, there will be some punishment if there'll be, let's call them incentives to get the vaccination, because that's how they'll put it. So smallpox was a really terrible disease. I think it had something like a 30% fatality rate. So, you know, and you wonder why, you know, so most people would probably want to get it, particularly since it was a natural vaccination. There were 2 strains of it. One of them was not deadly. And so people were injected with that really mild strain of it, and few people had problems. And you know, those who had problems or thought that they might genetically be sensitive to something like that could opt out. That seems reasonable enough. But when this went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court decided, they upheld that case. And they said that the government, a state government, had the right to mandate any medical procedure if there was potential to do harm. So they decided that Jacobson had potential to do harm. Potential to do harm is a pre-crime, basically. You haven't committed a crime yet. You have not harmed anyone yet, and yet you are being punished for the crime of what you might have done. So that is the issue. That's very, very important. But the court ruled that the state has a right to do that, even if it could harm you. In the case of Jacobson, they had a right to force him to get a vaccination or get fined because of the greater good. So the government has the right to harm you for the greater good. And the comparison was made to the government has a right to force you to go to war and fight for your country for the greater good, because the war is the best possible good. Well, we know that sometimes wars are not exactly fought for the best reasons. And a lot of people die on the front lines defending oil, capturing resources, you know, a variety of things. So the argument to do something for the greater good is always fraught with problems.
Right.
Who is going to decide what the greater good is? A very, very small group of people who could use that argument to do all sorts of terrible things. Hitler comes to mind. So the greater good should never be used for any kind of legal argument.
Absolutely.
So, and also in that decision, they talked about the public health risk that was posed. And as I mentioned, in that case, it was something like 30%. With the coronavirus, the risk to the general public is, well, early on, we knew it was quite low to the general public, 0.1%. It is still the case that 95% of people who get it don't develop any symptoms. And so it leads me to question the severity of the response to COVID based on those facts.
I tell you, the thing that scares me the most about COVID is how the treatment of it is so hyper-regulated. there's a doctor in this state, in New York. I know part of his name is Cameron. I can't remember if that's his first or his last name, but he made some YouTube videos where he was theorizing that.
Cameron Seidel.
Yes, Cameron Seidel,
Mhm.
where he was talking about the treatment protocols
Yes.
for the intubation of patients for COVID, how they could be damaging their lungs with the settings on the ventilators.
Yes.
And here's, you would think that if you're in the hospital and your doctor's thinking, oh, this is up too high, they can turn it down, but no.
Yes.
They're not allowed to deviate from the set protocol that was just made for a blanket standard, not your individuality and
Right.
your body. So there's been a lot of people who have been coming out of the treatment who are having ongoing chronic health problems, breathing problems that are now not the COVID. They're not related to the COVID, but possibly to the treatment. When President Donald Trump started taking the hydrochloroquine for his prevention,
Yes.
his own experiment. Now, mind you, someone like Donald Trump can just go to their doctor, have a relationship with that doctor, and not have all these other
years. It's been around for 70 years.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
but all of a sudden it was locked down for the regular people. Doctors are not allowed to prescribe that because, oh no, press.
In 2015 for the original SARS-CoV virus, hydroxychloroquine was discovered to be an effective treatment in 2015. So it has nothing to do with President Trump or his advice. But here is my
the way it was. But
no,
the,
I know they spun
but the way it was reacted to of that now doctors can't prescribe it. Now a doctor who's working with a regular American who's on Medicaid isn't allowed to go into that toolbox and pull out that tool.
Well, because there's a much more expensive one that, pharmaceutical company is going to make a lot of money on that does basically the same thing, but not quite.
The heart of allopathy right there.
So here's my emergency protocol. Anytime you're encountering a new situation, a novel coronavirus that you're uncertain about, you're not sure what the treatment should be, you're not sure what the symptoms are going to be or how the disease is going to progress, what you do is relax the protocols at the top. And you allow people who are working on the front lines in the ICU where Cameron Seidel was working and then later in the ER to study, make decisions, try different treatments, and then talk to other people in his community and very quickly come up with a new plan. That is the definition of an intelligent.
That is how discoveries are made on the cutting edge.
Right. That's how it's done. That's how it's done. And I don't have to be the one to say that. We know that. We know that from common sense, but common sense was thrown out the window. And anyway, despite the censorship, Dr. Cameron Seidel did talk to doctors who were experiencing the same situation in Italy, in Boston, in California, and they did come up with alternative protocols, and they did, privately communicate to people, and nurses and doctors did start treating patients differently. Often against the orders from the top down. And of course, the financial incentive to put people on a ventilator. I'll just leave it at that.
And there was also, I understand, an opioid shortage for keeping people comatose. When they're intubated, they're supposed to be kept in a catatonic state, and I can't really verify this, but I've heard in certain places there was such an opioid shortage because the government has been demanding that producers no longer make opioid medicines. They're doing everything they can to just eradicate this entire class of medicines from pharmacopoeia to try to create a new customer base for heroin and street opiates. But anyway, it's resulted in a shortage where people have been conscious and intubated. which is not something that anyone should really ever have to go through.
Right. I know one man pulled out his tube in Elmhurst Hospital, and he was one of the few patients who survived his COVID treatments because he got the tube out and walked out. So.
Also, the test, this nasal swab that goes all the way into the nervous system, that's potentially dangerous. Also, I've heard that it's less accurate and puts healthcare workers at more risk to conduct the test.
Every time you conduct the test, people have a tendency to sneeze. So that would put health workers at risk.
There's got to be a better way to test.
I don't know. I don't know whether there is or not. For those people who are advocating test, I would like to know what is being measured.
Yeah.
Is it a fragment of RNA? And if so, how long is that fragment? What is the possibility that other coronaviruses may have that partial sequence of that RNA? So assign a probability to it. Has the, what are the identifying features of the SARS-CoV-2 coronavirus? And is that what you're testing for? Or are you just testing for other things like the protein?
Yeah, I've seen some of these articles, news articles, and they're talking about people who continually test positive, but then in the body of the article, they're saying that the person is showing antibodies. Well, if you've had a disease and you've recovered, you should have antibodies because now you have a certain immunity toward it. So what are they really measuring? It doesn't sound like actual viri.
Either the test is, well, if this many people are testing positive who are asymptomatic, then that means the fatality rate of the disease has plummeted well below, most viruses that we know of. I doubt that that's the case. I do think that the coronavirus, the SARS-CoV-2, is a dangerous virus. What I think is probably happening, though, is these tests are just picking up just other coronaviruses, basically cold viruses, particularly on the people who are asymptomatic. But I'm not a medical doctor, so that's just my guess. I shouldn't say that, but it's got to be one or the other. Either the virus is not that fatal because so many people have it and are not dying, and the hospitals are not being overrun, or the tests are giving us a lot of false positives. It's either one of those two, and I'm not qualified to say which. So.
Yeah, I would be kind of worried about the possibility of nerve damage from that test.
From that test, there was a boy, 1.5-year-old toddler. The test swab broke off in his nasal cavity. He died later. They tried to remove it and couldn't. I don't, I know that the mucous membrane is part of your defense system, first defense against any kind of viral pathogen. And to be constantly invading that and interfering in any way with it might be something that I would want to investigate, and whether or not that could potentially cause harm.
Yeah.
Certainly, to force people to take that test in order to get into school or to go to your job or to fly or whatever is a precursor to the next condition of the mandatory vaccination.
Mm-hmm.
And again, with this mandatory vaccination, it would be mandated because you would be a potential to do harm. That's a pre-crime. That goes against our Constitution to punish people because they might cause harm. It is operating on greater good logic, where the people in power decide what's good, and the people in power decide that they can inflict potential harm on you for the greater good. And that goes against our Constitution. There's no reason to mandate a medical procedure that that everybody can study and learn about and be convinced that this is something that would be good for them and that they want to do.
Absolutely. It is not a hard sell.
It is not a hard sell.
Not.
So there, there is no need to make a helpful vaccine.
Mm-hmm. And also the way a vaccine is supposed to work. We give vaccines to animals, like to dogs. They have the rabies vaccine here in New York. It's required by law. Now, the dog gets the rabies vaccine. It's not every member of the household who lives with the dog who has to get the rabies vaccine. It's not every animal in the forest then has to be rounded up and vaccinated against rabies. It works that the dog has the vaccine for rabies and the immunity. Now the dog can go and interact with the wide unvaccinated population at large and has the protection from the vaccine. If we're saying that our flu vaccines or our smallpox vaccines only work if everybody has them, well, something's wrong with the way that vaccine is working then.
Right. What is the efficacy of a vaccine? I don't know whether or not that information is published, or even if they know, because they often don't do blind studies. But yeah,
it requires the entire population to have it in order for it to work. I think we should be looking at another model of disease control, because that's just
it doesn't always work. It doesn't always trigger the antibodies. So not everyone is immune when you take the vaccine. Not everyone is immune if you catch a disease, although I think that it's probably somewhat more certain that the antibodies that you develop from a natural case of the disease are longer lasting. But I don't know. I'm not that kind of doctor.
There's also titers, the test to see what immunity a person already has. There's a way to actually check for immunity.
Right, so that you don't.
And it's kind of a foreign term to the mainstream medical profession, although it shouldn't be.
I know the threshold level was raised for that recently. It used to be if you met some particular number, you were considered still immune from your childhood vaccinations. And they raised that. And recently, when I went overseas, I had to get everything examined, and I was, just on the border of being able to qualify as immune. And I asked my doctor about it, and he said, "Oh, they raised the standards. That's why." I said, "Oh, okay. I was always immune before, but I hope they don't raise them more, because then I'll be forced to get more vaccinations." So,
vaccine injury is very real.
I've heard some stories from the people who are part of this group that I've been going around with on the weekends. I'm very, very troubled by it, because it happens to children. And my own story with that is that I was not aware that there were these kinds of problems. When my son was 6 months old, I took him to get his vaccinations. I couldn't get to my doctor in Manhattan, so I went to a local clinic here. It was part of a New York State health clinic. And then the nurse there said to me, boys have a higher rate of a negative reaction to this vaccine. It was the MMR. And she said, "I'm going to suggest that we break it up, and he's only going to get one shot. And you come back in 6 months and get another one, and come back in another 6 months and get another one." And I said, "Okay, thank you."
Yeah, wow. They can actually break the MMR down into 3?
No, not anymore. Not anymore. At the time, yeah. And by the time I did bring my son back to get the additional shots, they were very confused, saying, how did he not get that we don't even have the,
Oh.
yes. So, you know,
That's the vaccine that I got an injury from, was the MMR. It's a combined virus multi-vaccine. Any veterinarian that I have ever talked to says you never want to give a combined vaccine, like, ever. And this is an example of one that is a combo that is amazing that you were able to get it broken down into individual.
it wasn't me. It wasn't me. I didn't make this decision. I had a New York State licensed nurse who
But I
advised.
mean that the practitioners were able to have access to that time.
I stumbled onto that one, and I'm grateful.
We are losing a lot of technology. We were talking before about the development, the advancement of technology, but I also see where we are losing technological capabilities all of the time. We are losing medical cures, medical breakthroughs.
Choices, and our choices are being narrowed.
Mm-hmm.
What, you know, the MMR is, you know, the vaccinations are highly regulated. And so the only ones that you can get are the ones with the combined. Now, if you know, of course, libertarians always want to do away with regulations. And people think that's terrible. You know, people will be harmed if we get rid of the regulations. Well, actually, we have regulations.
Being harmed by regulation.
Protecting these large pharmaceutical companies and allowing them to corner the market. And that's the only one that your kid can get. So if we didn't have that regulation, if we had more choices in the kinds of vaccinations that we could choose for our kids, we would be able to make better choices, but we don't have any choices. And so we have to act stupidly and go along with whatever we're told to do.
Mm-hmm.
But we're not allowed to think for ourselves. And so that is what the free market is to a libertarian. You know, not allowing the government to force you into buying a product that could be harmful to you. That's not what we want. That's not what we want. The road to hell is paved with good intentions, and that's those people who want more regulations. That's the outcome of more regulations. Quite often is the lack of responsibility and the lack of consequences for those who do harm, and no reward for those who do well either. So it's that all the way
regulated into chaos. Like regulation and law and order is not the antithesis of chaos necessarily, because you can certainly legislate and regulate a society into chaos, which is what we have right now.
Yeah, I mean, we do have regulation called the courts, where if someone causes harm to someone else, they can be punished. That is the regulatory function of our law. But you know, it disappoints people sometimes that we have to wait for a crime to be committed before we punish someone. So unfortunately, you know, like a lot of our people want to control the world and make it safe where nobody ever gets any harm, and nobody has to hear any bad speech, and
they want to be perfectly safe.
Right, and everything's perfect, but you know, it's you can't do that. You can't orchestrate that, because if you give anybody the power to try to do that, they will become a tyrant and a fascist. So we can't give away that power to anyone. You know, you know, all of our rights come with a downside, like
responsibility.
Yeah, you know, free speech, right? Mm-hmm. I defend free speech, and a lot of people were saying when Alex Jones got cut off the air, well, you know, he is a terrible person, whatever. Yeah, if you're not standing up for that terrible person that says all those awful things, then you don't care about free speech, because free speech isn't there to protect the kind of speech that everybody agrees with. Free speech amendment and our free speech right is there to protect the people that nobody wants to hear. Mm-hmm. People that are saying things that go against the norms. Free speech is to protect the minority dissenter.
On that note,
Yeah.
Well, we're talking about free speech, and you are hearing this message here on WGXC 90.7 ACRA. I want to remind our listeners that this is community-supported radio. We are not driven by commercials and big advertisers and the moneyed interests. We are funded by listeners like you, our local community. So please consider going to our website, wavefarm.org, and becoming a sustaining supporter of this radio station to keep free speech on the airwaves. Victoria Alexander, thank you so much for being my guest today on our show. We have about 4 minutes left. Is there anything else you would like to share with our listeners or some thoughts?
I want to echo what you just said there about the importance of people supporting radio that's not funded by any of the big corporations. This is probably the single most important cause that you can support. And I understand that most audiences feel like information is their right, that they have a human right to information. And therefore, a lot of people want their information for free. And I get it. I completely get it. There's somehow you should be able to get your information for free, but we don't have a system in place for that right now. And I've been trying to figure out some sort of policy or program that would, fund journalism and fund research and fund art. And honestly, I can't think of it. I have worked in the nonprofit area my entire life, and believe me, it's very, very hard to fund the nonprofit. So that's how we get by now, by donations from people, but it's not enough. So until we can figure out how to solve this problem, please donate to the station. And keep them on the air. It's extremely important. Heather has spent a great deal of time researching these things and talking to people. That's a lot of sacrifice from her life to bring this to you. And so please do donate. Support journalism.
Thank you so much, Victoria. We really appreciate that. Appreciate having you on the show, and I just certainly wish you the very best in your endeavors. I'd love to see all of this regulations start to be whittled away so we can again see the face of freedom, of our community, of what our country is supposed to be. It should not be a place where people have to struggle and fight for the right to get health care, or the right to access the medicine that is going to help them have quality of life.
When I get to Congress, I will not write any new laws. I'll try to get rid of some of the bad laws. If I can tell people where to go for more information, I have two websites, alexanderforcongress.com, that's the number 4, alexanderforcongress.com, and also another website that I had for years and that I will continue, called directdemocracyus.org, because I want to hand the power of Congress over to the people, directdemocracyus.com. So thank you.
Excellent. That all sounds great to me. I keep saying I wish more politicians would get in and take away laws than make more laws, because it's an untenable situation. Just the amount of volumes that are sitting there of legislation, or
they tried to count them once and they were not able. There's so many. Mm-hmm.
Exactly. So there's no way to really apply something that's that spread out and confusing. Hopefully we can get to a better future and a freer society, one that's just more equitable for all. Thank you so much, Victoria Alexander. Thank you, listeners, for joining us today. You're listening to Medical Freedom on WGXC 90.7 FM.